unfortunately, there is an abuse of the system. Okay, so the same people are rating the exams. Okay, now they get a full grade off, but I may change that. If the third exam is late, I'll just fail you for that exam, the entire exam, which means you may fail the course. Okay, so there are, a number of, they just hand in the exam and take off. So that is an abuse of the system. It makes grading the exam, not that they give a shit, but it makes grading the exams that much more difficult for the TAs. Okay, because, you're in it, you got all the, you don't know this, but some of you will be teachers someday, you will. So it's much easier to grade a set of exams all at once than have them coming in piecemeal, number one. Number two, it abuses the system. It makes me feel like a fool. I hate to feel that way. I don't like that. I did this for your benefit. So you didn't have to come in and take a sit-down exam. That was the reason for this. You think that we enjoy grading? Now, unfortunately, the numbers are getting higher. I was going to say, 90% of you are okay, which is always the case. Let's assume it's 90% okay, it's 10%, which is still a lot of students. We've got 12 to 15 students, somewhat more than 10% that are using the system. Those are people also that will run red lights. If I could, I would strangle them. It sets up a real bad precedent for the rest of their life. They don't know that, but I do. It's unfortunate. And their parents would kill them. Pay good money to do that? That's crazy. But I'm telling you now, since some of you are in the room, you haven't left. If you do it on the third exam, because we now know who exactly you are, that I don't care the reason. The same person hands that in late will fail you on that exam. I don't care what you wrote. Get that exam to us when it is due, which will be on the 10th of the month. It will be 1 week from the 3rd, May 10th. Okay. On the question of these communist collectives, let me pick up there again. So you're going to have a question on these communist collectives on the final exam. There'll be 2 questions. And one of the questions, you'll have a choice on one of the parts. And one of the choices here will be on these communist collectives. Stalin sets up these communist collectives. So he does establish the communist fundamental class process in agriculture where the majority of the people still live and work. He does do that. And it's very successful. It works. But then he turns around and through a variety of different mechanisms tends to squeeze and undermine the very communist fundamental class process that he establishes. And what he does then is the following. We have the total value of the grain, plus the other crops, and I'll stay with grain, that's the total value, minus the cost. So this is the depreciation of all the means of production used up to produce the grain, plus all the distributions that have to be made from the surplus. But don't forget now, the collectivity of workers now receive that surplus. That's why it's communism. The same collectivity that produces it gets it. And the residual, what's left, is the wages of the workers. And they're rewarded on the basis of labor units performed. The more units you perform, the more wages you get. So what happens here is, over here, the planners are directed by Stalin to set the price of grain below the unit value of grain. So this is the total value over here. I'm sorry. The price is set below the unit value of grain. So the value of grain that the farmers receive, the total value, the price times what they produce and sell, is less than the total cost of producing that grain. The C plus B plus S over here, the total cost, which includes their profits, is less than what they receive from the state. If this is 1,000, this is 800 rubles.
What is the numerator above the UV?
This thing?
One down.
So this is the total value in communism of the grain divided by the number of units of grain produced. Always.
So it's even.
That's the total value in the number. The total W. The W is the same as the E. It's the same. So if it takes, again, if it takes 1,000 rubles to produce the grain, the state says, okay, we're going to give you 800. We'll give you 700. We'll give you 600. We'll give you 500. We'll give you 400. So it's not as if the grain farmers, the communist farmers, are not producing grain. They're producing grain. That's this amount. They're producing it. The grain production increases. But the price that they get for what they produce and turn over to the state keeps falling. And that's deliberate. Number one. Number two. While you're squeezing this side of the equation, so you're pushing that down by this procedure, you keep on pushing what's in the bracket up. The same state authorities who have state officials in every single collective across this land. So the state bureaucracy expands with these communist state officials going into these various collectives via the machine tractor stations that I mentioned to you. They go in there and they say, look, not only do you have to take care of the depreciation of your means of production so you can continue to produce grain in the future, replace all your machines that have used up, replace your animals that have used up, you have to do that. But we also mandate that you make a variety of different distributions here. Payments that you have to make. Don't forget, the surplus has to be distributed. So you have, as I told you last time, you have to take a portion of that surplus that you're receiving as a collectivity. The state does not receive the surplus. The communist collective receives the surplus, and hence the state now has a problem on its hands, which it doesn't receive the surplus. Because the communist collective, that's what communism means. So then it intervenes and it forces the farmers, as much as it can, to spend that surplus that the farmers initially get on rents, on tractors. So the state puts tractors in these machine tractor stations in the rural areas, and it says to the collectives, you must rent 5 tractors. You have no choice. And you have to pay us higher and higher rents for these tractors. And as I told you, it mandates that they spend money that is part of their surplus on health care and nursing and education and all kinds of public goods. It mandates that they have to spend a portion on accumulating everything but tractors, other kinds of means of production. They have to set aside money for reserves in case of bad weather, always a problem in agriculture. So the state intervenes, and I gave you a whole bunch of them before, it's in your reading, that everything in the bracket is going up, at the same time this is going down, and hence This is squeezed. You can see that. So the consumption of the communist workers are being squeezed. So the terms of trade are moving against the communist collectives through this state action even more than they did under the NEP with the ancient farmers. This is even more dramatic. You're reducing the price of grain. You're increasing the price of manufactures sold to the farmers, and hence the terms of trade are moving against the communist collectives, continually squeezing this, raising the prices of fertilizers, raising the prices of irrigation equipment, and finally, the prices of consumer goods to these communist farmers were also increasing. So it's not just that this was squeezed, but it became less than the prices of the manufacturers, the consumer goods, sold to the communist collectives. Yeah.
What does that say next to P on the bottom?
I can't hear that.
What does that say next to P on the bottom over there?
I don't know where.
In the denominator, the one
This?
circle to the left. Yeah.
This?
Yeah.
The price.
I just can't read.
This is what the farmers get when they sell. They get the price of grain. This is what they have to pay to produce grain. So this is what they buy, the farmers. The farmers sell grain, they buy what?
Means of production.
I can't hear that.
Means of production.
Means of production. So you reduce the selling price, at the same time, you increase the buying price of means of production. That's a disaster. That's a recipe for disaster, if you get away with it. So this is what's called in economics, the terms of trade move against the communist collectives. And then I'm adding to it. It's also the case that on this residual, which is being squeezed, the left-hand side is being squeezed from that, but also on the right-hand side, their expenditures are being squeezed. Because the price of consumer goods, not just means of production, the price of consumer goods that are produced in state capitalism, that's being increased. This is being cut. So look at the blackboard. This has to give. So in the 1930s, they starved to death. They actually starved. So across the Soviet Union, there is starvation. It's a lousy crop year. Excuse me. And the first thing that the farmers try to do, faced with this problem, is eat their seed. Their consumption is being squeezed, so they eat their animals. So across the Russia, they start to eat the animals. That's really bad, because if you eat animals, then that's destroying the possibility of getting next year's crop. And so you have this massive starvation within the Soviet Union during this period of time. So you have anger, you have apathy, anger, upset, and the risk of revolution in the majority of the population by squeezing the very communism you set up in agriculture. On the other side of it, in state capitalist industry, it benefits from this cost. This is the cost. It benefits. Why? Because it gets, to review what we did, it gets a surplus from state capitalist industry where it's established. So it gets a surplus, but now it gets something else. It squeezes it gets extra resources from this body. This is the turning of the terms of trade against the communist collectives, and hence this allows it to expand its payments in state capitalist industry. So communism is used by state capitalism to enhance its resources to expand the three things that I mentioned to you. Capital accumulation in industry, number one. Number two, a state bureaucracy. And number three, a military, the militarization, military industry. Ready? That's where I ended up. Now, so let me begin. Okay. Now, these tractors are introduced into agriculture. The collectors have no choice. They have to rent these tractors from the machine tractor station. So it is true, the state capitalist industry is producing more and more tractors. The supply of tractors increases rather dramatically. They are rented to the collectivities. And the hope is, and it's successful, the hope is that it will raise productivity in agriculture, and it does. So the productivity of the collectives goes up. Okay? So that does happen. So what that means is, in terms of what we did, that's a benefit to the communist collectives, because the price of grain is less than the unit value of grain. So it's true they're reducing this, but you can see from the blackboard, if the right-hand side falls even more, that'll be a benefit to the collectivities. In other words, if the cost of grain can fall more than what you can sell the grain for, then the collectivists will be doing better. So it is true this falls. That is, as the productivity rises, the unit value of, the denominator increases, the unit value of grain falls. But every time that happens, the plan is to decrease the price of grain even more. So it's like a treadmill they can't get off of, that is the farmers. Their productivity rises, so their productivity rises, that's good for them, but then the state turns around and reduces the price of grain even more than the rising productivity. Okay. We have then, as the 30s go on, especially including this terrible famine year, we have the risk, we have starvation, we have people are angry, as I told you, they're writing letters to Pravda, the national newspaper. They start attacking these state officials and these machine tractor stations. You've got a potential revolt in the Soviet Union. And Stalin gets the message, and so he passes a new reform. Remember reform? So there's a reform in agriculture. And the new reform, as I mentioned to you last time, is the following. Stalin says, I will allow you, communist collectives, to engage in private production of certain kind of items which you now can sell on a free private market. He reintroduces into agriculture the ancient class structure which just 7-8 years before he destroyed. So he says to the farmers, and I can't give you the details of it, but he says to the farmers, look, you now can produce, I don't remember the number, 22 rabbits every year or whatever. So he puts a limit on the number of rabbits. You can raise rabbits, and then you can sell your rabbits to whomever will buy them. You're allowed to have whatever, 50 chickens, and you can harvest your chickens and sell them, as well as the eggs, to whoever will buy on a private market. You can butcher 2 or 3 of your hogs, and you can sell them as pork, but most importantly, you can sell them as ham and salami. You are allowed to grow some vegetables on your farms, where the climate and soil is suitable. You can grow tomatoes and lettuce and so forth, onions, most important, potatoes, important part of the diet, and you can sell them in the free market. So what he does then is introduce a new class structure into agriculture, which, it happened here, but he got rid of it. He introduced a new, in order to diffuse the explosive situation. And he says that, actually. He says, we were dizzy with success, as I mentioned to one of you after class. We were dizzy with this communist success. So we abused the farmers, and now we have to step back, and now I'm going to reintroduce private farming. But he doesn't get rid of the collectives. So he maintains the collectivities, the communist farmers, in grains and important raw materials, sugar beets, cotton, tobacco. So he maintains these collectivities, while at the same time he introduces the ancient class structure. He allows them to grow these particular kinds of items around their little huts in the rural. The huts were private. Around their little houses in the rural areas, they could have their rabbits, their chickens, and their eggs, and so forth. And they can sell the products only by themselves. There's no private merchants. So they themselves have to act as their own merchants. And what happens, it's interesting, what happens is that in the weekends, the people from the cities go into the rural areas and they purchase this stuff from the farmers. Farmer life, on the weekends, will sell the rabbits and the hams and the salamis and the eggs and so forth, the fresh produce, to those people who leave the cities. So you have a hybrid in agriculture. The hybrid is a combination of the communist collective and these ancient farmers. A combination of the two. Not one, it's both. Although the ancient is prescribed in a variety of ways under these rules and regulations. Because it's a free market, and because employment in state capitalist industry is growing so rapidly because they're squeezing agriculture, the price of these ancient products over the price of manufacturers, so this is the new terms of trade. So these are the price of the rabbits, the hams, the salamis, the eggs, okay, that the farmers, the communist farmers are producing in this class structure. This increases dramatically. Whereas the price of the grains under communism over the price of manufacturers falls. Yes?
What's the net effect?
Huh?
What is the net effect?
What does what?
What of both of those together, what's the net effect when you add both of those numbers together? The ratios.
I don't understand your question.
So when you take the two ratios that you have there, what is the net effect? Are the
What you mean? What's the result of all this?
yeah? I mean, are the farmers now making more money relative to the means of production?
What the net result of all
Right.
this is? Johannes.
Sorry?
Yes. Let's go back 2.5 months. Did you hear his question?
What's the net effect?
Yeah. What's the so what? It connects to something. You don't have to raise your hand. Go. It connects to something that you were interested in 3 months ago. Incentives. Go ahead, man. No?
Well, there's a decrease in incentive for the production of grain, so
And
grain is produced on a
there's a decrease in the incentive to produce grain, and there's what?
increased incentive to produce those farmer
Okay,
goods.
listen carefully, because this is a theme from the 1930s on, which goes right after World War II, for almost every one of these East European countries. So what we have in the blackboard is very true in Poland, Czechoslovakia. It's not just the Soviet Union. So what is done here is something which was unintended. The incentive, I'm going to repeat what you just did. There is now a market incentive to devote your energy here because you can produce your rabbits, your hams, and so forth, and you get a higher return in this class structure than you would get here. The market incentive is against communist collective. It's for the ancient. If you're a farmer then, and you're a hybrid, you're caught in both, then your love and affection would go for which class structure? It would go for this. Or for this. It's not just that your economic interest. I don't want to reduce our love and affection for one another to economics, but it has a role to play. And so the farmer becomes enamored with this over this. And what you develop in agriculture, takes time, is a kind of schizophrenia, kind of craziness, in which you have two personalities in the same farm. One personality is as an ancient farmer, the other personality is a grain farmer. And over time, the ancient personality, with this free market, wins over against the communists. So what becomes of interest, it's harped upon again and again and again, is for the farmer to be able to devote more time and energy to this rather than this. So this is a general erosion of the communist collective that was established and was successful. Okay, so let me summarize what we've got. Yes, sir?
Well, so did Stalin do anything to try to change this?
I'm sorry?
Did Stalin and his predecessors do anything to try to change this?
No. Yes, one thing. He introduced state capitalism, that is, state capitalist farms into agriculture. So he did try to introduce another class structure in agriculture, which was to turn some of these farmers into wage workers. And so the big impetus after this, in part because of this, and the tensions that arose here, was to introduce capitalism into agriculture, state capitalism into agriculture. But in terms of your question, that was limited though. That was not. This hybrid continued right after World War II, and so all the tensions associated with this continued. And the people thought that the only thing that was working, that was successful, was this. They called this capitalism. It wasn't. It was an ancient class structure. So when the 1980s rolled around, in the agricultural sector, we still had a significant portion of the population. This is what they wanted, not this. Okay, let me summarize that. You had in the 1930s, actually starting in the late 20s, you had the dismantling of the new economic policy by Mr. Lenin. So Stalin is now in power, Lenin's dead. And Stalin establishes, right now, private capitalism, he establishes private communism in agriculture. Not state. Okay, this is what I taught you. These are not state farms. These are private farms of a communist nature. And it's on a vast scale. So here, workers were collectively appropriated and distributed the surplus that they had produced. That was successful. So if you ask me, was communism established across the 20th century? Yes. Here's one example. Number two, a rapidly growing and expanding state capitalism in industry and its extension to agriculture with these state capitalist farms. So you had in agriculture a real complexity. You had in agriculture the communist collectives, the ancient farms, and then the state capitalist farms. They were called that, state capitalist farms. Sorry, they were called state farms. By World War II, you had this very complex society. You had this recently established communism, the very recently established ancient, the very, very recently established state capitalist farms, and a rapidly growing state capitalist industry centered in a few cities. I want to now turn to this state capitalism, okay, in industry. So much has been written about it. It's very difficult for me to describe to you what occurred from the 1930s on, when all of this got underway. But basically, the USSR was transformed from a relatively underdeveloped poor nation into one of the most powerful industrial countries in the entire world in a very short, like 10 years. So this was a more rapid industrial development than the entire world has seen heretofore, and more rapid than anything that has been experienced today by China, India, or Japan. This was big. This went from a real poor country, devastated by World War I, into perhaps the third most powerful industrial nation in the world, after the United States and Nazi Germany, than the Soviet Union. Here, I don't usually do this, but I'm going to do it to give you a flavor. Don't copy this now. These are numbers. From 1928 to 1940, these are growth rates per year. Steel production was over 11% per year. So in a short period, let me give you iron production, 12.6, 13%, 11% steel, 13% in iron. What that means is if you put the two together, iron and steel, in a short period of time, the Soviet Union became a major industrial power. It was producing the two most important ingredients for industry, iron and steel. In how long? 10 years. That's how they were able to produce the tanks and the artillery pieces and the machines and the tractors and so forth. The Sputniks, all that stuff. In a very short period of time. The rate of growth of capital, of machines, was 12% per year. No countries ever have that. The rate of growth of employment in industry, so this is just employment in industry, was 7%. That means unemployment became zero. Your ratio to people. Everybody had to work. Everybody in the society had to work. Mommies, daddies, children, grandparents, everybody. And take on more than one job. 7% per year. In the United States, we have growing, until recently, we had growing unemployment. Here you had growing employment at 7% per year. So the capital labor ratio, if I take the difference between the two, was growing at over 5% per year. That means that more and more of the growing labor force was equipped with more and more machines. Electric power, almost 20% per year. So it was the electrification of the entire country in a short period of time. So this country, which lived with candles, almost overnight, was powered by electricity. And all that that means, you know what that means. We take it for granted. You can't read by candle unless you are Abraham Lincoln. That's a joke. But all of a sudden, overnight, everybody could now study with electricity. Tractor production, 30% per year. So many tractors were produced that they could not be used. So it was an inefficient production of tractors, but be that as it may, They produced 30% per year for these machine tractor stations, so every single collectivity had more than one tractor. So it's not terribly surprising that productivity in agriculture rose. Heavy industry as a proportion of the total value added of manufacturing. So you get the total value added of manufacturing, then you ask, okay, what proportion of that is accounted for by heavy industry, machines, rather than consumables? In 1928, it's a third. By the war, just before the war, it's 70%. So they doubled it in just about 10 years' time. So it becomes a country that's producing massive amounts of machines. And finally, the proportion of industry to the total national product goes from 28 to 50%. 28 in 1928, by the war it's 50%. So half their national wealth is coming from industrialization. So there's no issue here, but industrialization take. Yes, sir.
I'm just curious. Do you have, in comparison, what did agricultural output increase during that period?
I don't have it in front of me. They took off. So they squeezed the collectivities, and they relieved it a little bit by the introduction of the ancients. But be that as it may, the continual pressure was on the collectives to produce more and more grains and raw materials, and they succeeded, along with the increase in productivity. So they did it. They had an increased, what's called in economics, an increased, not the surplus, but a different kind of surplus. They had an increased marketable surplus of grain, which was flowed into the cities to feed this growing 7% per year of employment. And there was no, it's not the States, there was no excess grains. You didn't put them in storage. You used them all to feed the expanding the expanding labor force. The nature of appropriation changed. Okay, let me go back on this one, on state capitalism. I told you that under NEP, under the new economic policy, that the state tried a decentralization of appropriation of surplus in the hands of local officials. So local officials in the consumer good industry were allowed to appropriate and distribute the surplus on a decentralized basis across the Soviet Union. Not in heavy industry, but only consumer goods. That all changed. Now there was a full and complete centralization of the appropriation of the surplus and its distribution in a set of industrial ministers that sat in Moscow. So there was I don't know how else to describe it, a centralization of the surplus in very few hands. It was like you had a giant board of directors established in one industry, sitting in Moscow, with roughly about 1,000 people, in a population of roughly about 300 million. You had about 1,000 people that became the appropriators and distributed the surplus right across the Soviet Union, and it was called the Council of Ministers. In your readings, the CON, the Council of Ministers. And you had to write a new constitution to allow that, which they did. And this Council of Ministers replaced the old ministers. The old ministers was called, correctly, Veneska, Vesenkha, Veneska. So that was gone. That was what they had in the 1920s. And in the late 20s and 30s, under this new constitution, you had this COM. And so we became the receiver of surpluses right across the Soviet Union, produced by the state industrial workers, which were growing rapidly. And the surplus that it appropriated was just taking off. And most of the people knew their names. Let me just give you a taste of the future. So you have roughly 1,000 people that are appropriating these profits and distributing them. After the 1980s, when all of this collapsed, when the Soviet Union collapsed, and the state capitalism turned into private capitalism, many of these people were dead by now. But the same families became the new appropriators of the surplus into the private capitalism that arose. Same family names. Sociologists could trace this right here. So it's a single board of directors was put into place on the stock for both capital goods, which it always was, but now for wage goods as well. Next, very important. The mass and rate of exploitation took off. It wasn't just that the state squeezed these collectives, these communist collectives in the way that I described it, but they also began to squeeze the industrial workers. So the surplus value in state capitalism, plus the squeezing of the communist collectives, in these two ways: the terms of trade, and the rents for the attractors. Those two dramatic ways. It wasn't just this, but this took off. And what I mean by this is that the mass of the surplus increased because, and go back to the first part of the course, employment rose, little l. So, more and more workers, what's the number I gave you? 7%. The rate of growth here was 7% per year. This increase, which enabled the Council of Ministers to get an expanding use value of labor power. You would be like GE, GM, and so forth, expanding its employment, which expands the surplus for the capitalists. Except now, it's under state capitalism, so it's this Council of Ministers expanding employment and getting more and more of the surplus. So, the surplus is equal to the rate at which you can exploit them times the number of workers times the hours that they work. So, you expand this, you actually expanded the hours, and you expanded the intensity at which you exploited the workers. If you keep the V the same, this explodes. So that's part of the history. From 1930 to 1980. So for 50 years, they did this. And this surplus took off. The massive surplus rose, okay, because, let me get rid of this, because they just expanded employment. But they also, not just expanded employment, they raised the intensity. They made people work faster. And they extended the hours in the factories. They did all three, but just let's focus on the mass. The mass rose because employment rose by 7% per year. And their surplus rose. Number two. Under Stalin, reduced the real wages of workers. In the 1930s and 40s. Let me do it again. Let me repeat it. Under this, the COM, the Council of Ministers, reduced the real wages of workers. Third, I'll put it here. They raised the intensity of work. What that means is you had speed up in the factories and increase the number of hours worked in the factories. So, the left-hand side of the equation, your resources in society, the profits in capitalism just took off. You squeezed the ancients. You squeezed the communists. And this enabled the right-hand side to grow. Grow what? State capitalism. So this left-hand side grew, enabling this to rise for what? capital accumulation. So capital accumulation in heavy industry, took off. Military took off. State bureaucracy took off, and police. And public goods took off. What I mean by public goods are higher education is free. In fact, they pay students to go to school. So not only would your tuition be free, but you would get money to go to school. Healthcare in this relatively poor country was free. Workers had free meals in the factories for lunch. They taught people how to play basketball, which was invented in the United States, and eventually beat the United States in basketball. They taught the people how to play hockey, and eventually beat the Canadians who invented hockey. They taught as many people who wanted to be ballerinas, to play the piano, to be gymnasts. They subsidized housing. Why did they do this? Now stay with, this is toward the end of the course, as I told you, stay with what I taught you. Why did they do this? Okay, but I know the two of you. Yeah, man.
Increase incentive to work.
Increase?
Incentive to work.
Okay. Why did they have to give them an incentive?
It gives someone something to be proud of. Like, makes them more proud of them.
Okay, let's listen to what he just did, because you can learn as much from your comrades as you can from me. Okay? So, I'm going to repeat what you just did nicely. You're squeezing the collective, the communist farmers. I understand you gave them the ancient, but it's not enough. You're still squeezing them. And you created this kind of schizophrenic existence for them, in which their emotions are being torn in two different ways, to the ancient and to the communist collectivity. Number one. Number two, you're squeezing the workers. I understand they're expanding. You're squeezing them. And you're reducing now their real wages. So you have in this society enormous success. And it's a society that's hanging on by its fingernails. It's extraordinarily fragile. Precisely because it's so successful. It's so successful by squeezing workers and squeezing farmers, that's your population, to fund all of this, and you've got to give something, otherwise you might have an explosion. And so what was developing over the time were two things. In economics, they began to produce more and more public goods, in part to diffuse the situation, but also in part because that's what they thought socialism was all about. Socialism to them was not the collective appropriation of the surplus by the workers. They had a different notion of socialism. And in the orthodox Marxist notion of socialism, it was you deliver public goods. So they had it wasn't one, it was two things. A, to diffuse the situation, but also it meshed nicely with their ideology of what was socialism. That was part of it. Okay? So that was the economic part of it. Give more here for these two reasons, but that wasn't all. It's a side, I told you, it's very fragile. Eventually, as you all know, 50 years later, it falls apart. There's a revolution in that country, in the 1980s in which everything I have in the blackboard falls apart. Private capitalism replaces everything we have here. No one expected this at the time. Shock to the world. Can you think of any other way that they could kind of hold, that is the state capitalist, the regime, the CON, along with the Communist Party, could hold this together in addition to the public goods? No.
The state police, you mix
The police? That's right. So let's go back. 1936. We're in Moscow. I'm teaching you. Okay? I'm Professor Resnick. Change my name. You're the class. You're the elite of the elite. Okay? In the state school. Your only state school. And one of you raises his or her hand and says to Professor Resnick, "Dear Professor, I think from what you have described and what I've learned about Marxism, that what you're describing is state capitalism and a ruthless exploitation of the industrial workers by reducing their real wages, allowing this surplus, which you're appropriating from the workers, to grow, which you distribute. Yeah, you give some to public goods, but it's on the basis of exploitation. And what you're saying about socialism is a lie. You are a hypocrite, Professor Resnick. And what will I do?"
Strangle him.
What?
Strangle him.
Well, how will I strangle that student? I will say the following. I'll say very kindly, you're clearly wrong, and you must either be crazy and need help. And so I will now have somebody come in and take you out and put you in a place to help you become sane, because what you're saying is crazy. So I will put you in an insane asylum for a period of time until you regain your sanity. Number one. Number two, I don't think you're sane. You are an agent of a Western power. And hence, you will have to be sent to a very cold place for a long period of time, because you're dangerous. Siberia, the Gulag, or I don't like you at all, I think there's no hope, and I'm going to shoot you. So one way to deal with this is with the state police and the rise of prison camps. You know the guy who wrote about this? Unfortunately. That's it.
Dostoevsky.
No. Post-war.
Ivan Denisovich, that one.
So you have novels on this, there's movies on this, it's very famous. So another way to deal with this, besides this, is to invest in police. So the KGB rises, and it becomes very powerful. It gets scared. And those people who do speak, and they do speak, people do speak, they get treated harshly. What's another way to do this? Can you think of any other way? These sophisticated folks. Think of our own country.
You could start by blaming all the other countries around the world for
Good for you. Okay? And this is coupled, this blame on other people, other countries around the world, is coupled with, and I want to come back to what the gentleman said over there. A new kind of theory arises, which is the following. Very, very effective. And it's actually still effective to a degree. Here's the new theory, the new culture, produced with the state capitalism, produced in particular by the Communist Party. A new civilization is emerging, in which the Soviet Union is an engine that's pulling the rest of the train. This new civilization is one of socialism that is going to bring peace and harmony and well-being to the entire world. And we, the Soviet Union, and you farmers and you workers, you are the engine that's pulling this civilization. It's fighting, but you're pulling it. And it started here in the Soviet Union, and it's going to spread throughout the world. It's a utopian idea. Go back to the lectures. They produce a notion of a new world, a new utopian, in which the Soviet Union initially is the center, and it's pulling along a recalcitrant citizenry in the rest of the world. But there are people, now go back to your point, who threaten this new utopia, and that's the capitalist West, led by the most dangerous capitalist nation in the world, the United States. Hence, for a period of time, you Soviet workers and you Soviet farmers must sacrifice. So it's called the cult of sacrifice. You have to sacrifice what? Lower real wages, longer hours in the factories, higher speed-ups. You must make that sacrifice in the short run so we can build a better society in the long run. So in these ways that I just mentioned to you, the Communist Party holds it together for 50 years. In this sacrifice, this notion of sacrifice, it turns out that Stalin was absolutely correct, because Russia gets invaded by Nazi Germany. So he said, look, I told you what's going to happen. And so when the Germans invade, this notion of sacrifice becomes so powerful, coupled with the idea of pride, as someone mentioned, in the military, and pride in the notion of socialism, that the country rises up to defeat the second most powerful industrial country in the world, which is that of Nazi Germany. And there, the expenditures, starting in the 1920s, on this, heavy industry and military equipment, allows the Soviet Union to literally wipe out the German armies. Okay? So that's it's being held together. This kind of system of these three class structures: ancient agriculture, state capitalism in industry, and communism in agriculture, and state capitalism also in agriculture. It's being held together in these different ways. Okay? Any questions on this? So you have this discontent, albeit this discontent, these tensions, this alienation, and sometimes even the risk of revolt in agriculture and industry that had to be dealt with in one way or the other. And this is the way that the state capitalists, under the direction of the COM and the Communist Party, that's how they dealt with it. That's how they tried to hold it together as it was almost coming apart at the seams. From the outside, it looked like it was cement. You could never practice. But as people, it's always ex post. After the fact, when people went back, they see the fissures in this type of society. All right. A couple of other things. Every time the state, under Stalin and Khrushchev and all the other prime ministers that followed after Stalin died, Resnick and the rest of these characters, every time they attempted to squeeze more out of the communist collectives, squeeze more out of the industrial workers, that enabled more resources to fund this. And every time that was successful, what they all did was increase the right-hand side, starting with Stalin. So the very success pushed them to expand all of this. It became a crazy kind of rat race. The success in squeezing enabled them to get more surplus, turn the terms of trade against the agricultural sector, against the communist farmers. That was successful. That enabled them to bump this, which then pushed them to want even more of this, to squeeze this more, to raise this, to raise this. That was the rat race. Every increase here led to this, which led to this, which led to this, which led to this. And then you're getting to possibility. Let me give you an example. Stalin, when he comes, Stalin in the 1930s institutes 5-year plans. Okay, so the 5-year plan was his idea, which was that in 5 years we should have, we should double our investment in heavy industry. After 3 years, he would say, I think we should treble it. So before the 5-year plan was over, he would revise the plan and increase the demands of the surplus, which in turn would propel the state to try and squeeze more out and to reduce the real wage even more. The generals come to Stalin as the 30s are rolling along, and they say to him, it looks as if this crazy house painter, Schickelgruber, now named Hitler, it looks as if this crazy guy is going to militarize Germany, and we've got a problem on our hands. And hence, you've got to build even more factories for this military equipment, because they invaded us in World War I, and they'll invade us again. Why? Because we got all the grain, and we got oil, we got all these raw materials, and that's what Nazi Germany needs, because they don't have too many raw materials. They want our raw materials. They don't want our people, they want the raw materials. And hence they could invade us and take us over. So you're going to expand this even more. Stalin says, it makes sense to me. So he builds new factories. It's a vast country. They're beyond the Ural Mountains, which are in the east. So in the east, he builds new factories, which takes an enormous amount of resources to do that, to build up the military equipment in order to resist what people guess will be a common invasion. We all know that in 1939, they formed a peace treaty with Nazi Germany, in which they divide Poland. So they scared to death of the Germans. The tensions in the society pushed them to invest more and more in public goods, in this ideology, and so forth, etc. So again and again, the right-hand side is increasing. Free education, blah, 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 which puts pressure on the left. Putting pressure on the left requires even more expenditures, because you're pressuring the left-hand side. Is a very difficult, if not impossible, situation to get out of this kind of mess. Eventually, is unbearable tensions. And the tensions really kind of burst apart this society starting in the 1980s for a number of reasons. First, not in order, it's a whole bunch of them, it's not just one. To use an old word that we settled on some time ago, it's overdetermined by many things. Number one, the Cold War ends. And it's got very little to do with the Soviet Union. It ends because an American president decides to have a détente, a peace with the Soviet Union. And this American president, you would never expect it from him. He's a right-winger, conservative, and he fights against the advice of his own military and his own right wing to make a peace treaty with the Soviets, with Ronald Reagan. Well, whatever his motivations, the détente, peace with the Soviet Union, removes the cult of sacrifice. You can't, it's very difficult for the Soviet Union then to appeal to the cult of sacrifice if the number one enemy, which I told you, is that of the United States, is no longer the number one enemy. Number two, they engage in a crazy, foolish war which drains them of resources. It's unsuccessfully waged. They don't win. but it requires an enormous amount of resources. And it undermines the confidence that people have in the military, which is not needed the way it was before anyway. That war is in, Afghanistan. Before the Americans. That's near Vietnam. Third, there's a radical change in communication in the post-war period. As the post-war period goes on. The change in communication, there's no minor matter, is not so much radio, it's television. Now, no matter where you're located in Europe, you can see the rest of Europe, which includes the United States. And so people in the Soviet Union began to see what the French and the Germans and the Italians and the Americans have, which is a high real wage which finances a high consumption. In the Soviet Union, what they have is a low real wage, for the reasons I gave you, with a low private consumption. They have high public consumption. That's true. We don't. They do. They get free medical care. We don't get free. I understand all that. But the attention is focused on the private goods. And so what they see in the capitalist West is precisely what they want. The TV sets and so forth. And hence, more and more pressure is put on the state to deliver a higher real wage. The state doesn't seem capable of doing it. They try. They try, but they don't seem to be capable of doing it. Into their heads has been built this ideology, this theory, that what they have to do is develop the forces of production. Remember, that's Engels. Develop the forces, and eventually they'll get the consumer goods. Well, the people no longer want to wait. The workers in agriculture, the workers in industry, they want a higher standard of living now. If you add just a couple more to here, you have enough for this regime to come apart at the seams, which is what happens. So the state capitalism disappears. Paradoxically, the collectors continue, and the ancients continue. But the state capitalism falls apart under these pressures. There's a revolution by the workers themselves. They go on the streets. So you do that again. This is a revolution against state capitalism. If you vote for the United States. It's a revolution by the workers against capitalism. But everybody there and here in the States thinks of it as a revolution against socialism and communism. They just have the wrong analysis or the wrong objective. This ruthless squeezing of agriculture, this ruthless squeezing of the workers, albeit for a long period of time it was held together in the ways I described to you, literally comes apart at the seams, and in the 80s it falls apart and is replaced by private capitalism, the continuation of some of the collectors, and the growth of the ancients in agriculture, and private capitalism in agriculture too, which is where it is today. So today it's a private, no longer socialism, called socialism, private capitalism in both agriculture and industry. Okay, here's what I'm going to do. I'm going to pick up and summarize what we did heretofore. Okay. And again, give you that exam on a week from today on that Tuesday. Make sure you come to class.